A camera is the world's best invention. You can capture moments, you can capture memories, and you can keep track of your own progress in life, all with a camera. And I want to explain to you the beauty of such a device. Now, I'm going to take us way back to the 1950s. And we're going to go and look at my grandmother. Now, my granny loved scrapbooking and taking photos of everything. And one day she went on holiday with her husband to one of these exotic locations. I'm going to say she went to Mauritius. And she took her camera with her, taking photos. They actually went to Victoria Falls. They went to Victoria Falls. My grandmother went to Victoria Falls. And the only way that I managed to find that out was because there was a photo that remained. I apologize, it was not an exotic location. It was Victoria Falls. I remember seeing a photo with my grandmother holding hands with my grandfather and standing there as they smiled. You know, my grandfather loved spending money on three things. Education, big one for him. Education. He wanted his children to go to university, go to school. Travel, and food. And so a camera was an integral part of their own experiences because it allowed them to capture all of the moments. And even in the army, they will not allow the soldiers to go out with their cell phones because there are GPSs on it and social media that could distract them. But they are allowed to keep a camera. You know, the most beautiful part about this camera, about technology, as I'm taking us back to the 1950s, was that there were no GPS. There was no GPS. There was no camera surveillance. There was none of this stuff that actually reduces our freedom in the modern day. And so having a camera is a vestige of a bygone era. And I suppose it also poses a question. What will you capture? That is the most important thing. Yes, other people will take videos, for example, you and I having a conversation here. Yes, other people will record sports events. You can find it streamed. You can find the Super Bowl streamed online. Super Bowl. But the most important thing is you and your story. And a simple little camera like this can tell a lot. You know, the saddest thing about a camera is that the photos that are produced by it are opportunities to meet a person for the first time and say goodbye to them for the first time. I saw this very, very sentimental video. It was very sad. Of a man who made a video saying, I might be dying soon, or I'm going to die soon. In my case, I had an issue because I felt like I was getting skinny and I was having an issue. So I was justified. Even with him, but he really was dying. I was just feeling a bit icky and sick. He really was dying. I believe he had just been cleared for cancer or something terrible. And he filmed a series of videos showing how his illness has progressed and gotten worse to the point where that was the last video. And so a camera was used to capture those videos. And through watching those series, through watching the videos, through hearing his story about how he got cancer and how he kept on fighting through and how he was dedicated to document the whole process, he captured his moment with a story. And unfortunately, for me as a viewer and for the millions of other people who were fortunate to have met him, we got to meet him and say goodbye to him in the same video. And that's a very sad reality. Juxtaposition of life and death. Juxtaposition of hope and of sadness. And that's so weird how that can emanate from a camera. Don't you find it peculiar that if you see photos on your cell phone captured by your camera from 5-10 years ago, you can instantly remember the moment? But if you never had that camera before, if you never had those photos, you would never ever be able to remember those moments. So not only can cameras capture someone, capture the spirits of a man, such that you can meet him and wish him well and on his way and say goodbye to him for the last time ever because of this, so too can you capture a moment and be reminded of a good time. Cameras are some of the biggest inventions in life. And I want to also take us back to the 1950s. Compared to now. Let's compare it. Back then, you had a newspaper. Now, it's all on your cell phone. So, we had newspapers. Not we, I wasn't around then. There were newspapers, there were torches, there were cameras, there were watches. But now, all of those tools have been amalgamated into one single cell phone. Just a side note, I read a book last night, and I haven't read for months, and all of a sudden I'm using words like amalgamate, using words like elucidate, using complicated vernacular like that, using phrases like vestiges of a bygone era. I don't understand it. Maybe, I don't know what it is. Maybe I'm just being blessed, manifesting abundance on a high frequency level. Anyways, the point of what I'm saying is that back in the 1950s, there was a division. Every single tool or every single purpose had a tool. You wanted to knock in a nail, you had a hammer. You wanted to tighten a screw, you had a screwdriver. You wanted to loosen a hinge, you had lubricant. You wanted to read a newspaper, you had a newspaper. But now we have so many of these tools amalgamated into one. I promise you in the 1950s, yes, maybe the patent for it was developed, that you had a tool that was a screwdriver and a hammer built in one. But it wasn't common. You had a toolbox with different tools. Now we have one cell phone. This camera, my friend, can only shoot video. This camera, this is a real, genuine camcorder, can only shoot video. And there was beauty in that era. That every single tool had one purpose. Because there was no division. I was doing this academic coaching story years ago for school to do better in exams. And one of the tutors was explaining a concept called switching costs. So for example, let's say you watch TV and then you go do your homework, and then from your homework you go into a business meeting. Let's just assume that. It's a bit odd, but let's assume that. What happens is, from the time you switch from going to watching TV to doing your homework, and then when you switch from doing homework to going into the business meeting, there's a cost associated with that. There's a mental load that your brain has to shift its focus. And so back then in the 1950s, when everything was singular and everything had attention and focus attached to it, everybody was able to focus on one thing, and they didn't have switching costs. I was reading about these historians. They called themselves members of the Venetian age. I could be wrong about that. But the point is that from 1914 onwards, the historians were no longer able to be singular, individual and atomized and amalgamate the entire course of history into one book. I'm reading a book called The History of Great Britain now. And so this book is written by 10 historians, each focusing in on one aspect of Great Britain. For example, the Roman Britain, Britain's colonization, but obviously it gets way more in depth and there are lots of historical facts. I've just read the introduction, the foreword. But the point is, when it comes to the past, how every purpose had a singular tool, where people could focus, where people had attention. This is even before 1914. You could have one man, and he had the capacity to write an entire book, for example, on the history of Britain. But now, in our day and age, with cell phones, internet, basically driving attention and shortening attention spans, now we need 10 historians to achieve the same purpose. So that's a very interesting point. And I want to end on this. Here's a camera. Again, you have a story. Why don't you capture it? I want to end on this very point, this very line, this very phrase, because it's in line with capturing your moment. Your life is a documentary. It just hasn't been recorded yet.